So welcome, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening. My name is Jack Dekkers. I'm a professor in animal breeding and genetics at Iowa State University, and I'm one of the co-PIs on the Agriculture Genome to Phenome initiative funded by USDA NIFA. I'm leading the field days, and this is already our 28th field day that we've had. And today we're going to hear about, for this topic, Addie Thompson. She's an assistant professor at Michigan State University, and she actually received one of the seed grants, one of the USDA NIFA AG2PI seed grants to develop teaching courses in plant breeding and computational plant sciences together in collaboration with industry. And then we have Dr. Nadilia Gomez. She is the Chief Technology Officer for Digital and Precision Ag Bioscience Platform at Iowa State University. She has a background in plant breeding and also quite a bit of experience in industry and startup companies. And she'll talk to us about public-private partnerships in commercialization. So should be a good series of set of talks and discussion. As usual, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I'll monitor those, and if it's immediately relevant to what the speaker is talking about at that point, I'll interrupt the speaker, and then we'll deal with the question right away. Or otherwise, we'll have discussion sessions at the end of the talks. We have a small group, small audience today. Slow day, summer, lots of things going on, but it is recorded, and we know that a lot of people, they view the recordings when it's convenient for them. But regardless, we should have a good discussion. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Addie.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jack. So I'm going to give a little bit of example or case study, you could say, on public-private partnerships in education and in research. And then Nadilia will get more into the hows. So I'm hoping to give you an introduction to why you might want to get involved in this type of partnership and what are some of the interesting and creative things you can think about. So I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of an introduction to myself, and then talk about some of the partnerships that we formed in teaching, and then some of the partnerships that have formed in the process of my research. So just to give you a little bit about me, I'm a mostly quantitative geneticist. My research involves working in phenomics and then predictive plant sciences. So I'm sort of fluent in computational biology, although it's not necessarily my training per se. I'm very passionate about plant breeding, and my work as a result is very interdisciplinary. I work with lots of people across different plant sciences and into engineering and computer science. The overarching theme of my research in my lab is investigating the genetic control of quantitative traits in maize and related species, with special emphasis on traits that are agronomically relevant and impactful for breeding programs. So what's important to plant breeders? In the picture here, you can just see an example of one of the years of our nursery. So we do have several different fields that we use for observation and for trials, some on-site, some off-site, but this is just the nursery where we make our crosses and make seed for our research. I do work as an assistant professor at Michigan State, and I started in January of 2018. I'm giving you just this little bit of overview so you can understand that my research is the majority of what I do, even though I'm going to spend more time talking about the teaching probably in this particular presentation, but it is sort of 20% of my appointment. I teach mostly graduate courses, so I teach an advanced plant breeding course, and then a course that I'll talk a lot about shortly, the Frontiers in Computational and Plant Sciences. And then just for fun, new this fall, I'm teaching an undergraduate honors seminar on plant phenomics and sort of genotype to phenotype modeling. Okay, so now on to the case studies. The first I'm going to talk about is the partnerships that we developed in teaching. As was hinted at, this is actually funded through the AG2PI seed grant, and it enabled us to start some of these partnerships, which was great. But I'm going to introduce you to the topics of the course first, and sort of why we even started the course in the first place. So some years ago, in Michigan State started a NSF research training program called IMPACTS, which roughly stands for Interfacing Computational and Plant Sciences. The idea was that we'd be bridging the gap between computational and plant sciences. So there'd be students coming into graduate school or who were in graduate school who were interested in both fields. Their major would be in one or the other, but they would find a project and then a sort of a co-mentor in the other field for cross-disciplinary training. As part of this program, we had to develop several courses. The first of which was sort of a foundations course to teach students the basics of the different fields, so they had equal footing to jump off from. Another course was sort of a professional development course that helps students learn how to present their research, or maybe about different types of career options. It's sort of a forums course. And then the final course, which is the one I'm going to talk about, is the Frontiers in Computational and Plant Sciences, that serves as a hands-on data science sort of course. And so the whole course was designed to be project-oriented, team-based, very interdisciplinary, and with an emphasis on communication skills. So the students come into the course having their own areas of expertise, but some familiarity about this interdisciplinary field. And then they form groups to actually work on cutting-edge data science questions. The way I like to describe this is that using this XKCD comic it's sometimes hard to explain the difference between what's want to create this app where a user takes a photo and then it checks whether they're in a national park, and the person says, okay, that's easy, we can look that up. Few hours, I can code that up, no problem. And then he says, and check whether the photo is of a bird. And she says, I'll need a research team in 5 years. So it's sometimes difficult in the plant sciences to say, okay, I have this plant science problem. It's good to understand whether that's going to be something that's extremely computationally challenging or something that is super easy that could solve, months worth of data analysis problems for the plant scientist. Okay, so the course itself, this is copied, sorry for all the wordiness here, but it's copied directly from the syllabus. So I explained to the students at the beginning of the semester, the course, obviously it's for grad students with an interest in both of these fields and in the intersection, but it's intended to give students experience working in teams with large data sets that they would encounter in real life scenarios in this transdisciplinary field. And so our course objectives, we say we want to teach first and foremost communication. So it's difficult to communicate effectively across disciplines until you really have a base level understanding across the disciplines. Address grand challenge problems interfacing computational and plant sciences using computational and quantitative thinking. Figure out how to solve stated problems using the data at hand, and then demonstrate improved project management and written and verbal communication skills. I point out to the students, nowhere am I saying, I want you to learn how to be a better coder. That happens oftentimes, but really what we're trying to do is teach the soft skills in this interface. So students come in expecting to learn lots of coding and data analytics, especially as they're relevant to their current work. Their future work could involve any number of different things that they've not even thought about yet. And so we emphasize that maybe this isn't relevant to your project right now, but it could be useful for you in the future. Similarly, they expect to learn about writing and running working code. But as you can probably guess, given the large space between these two dots, we have a lot of other things that are actually the realized learning outcomes. One of which is understanding different data types, whether that's things they've never heard about before or seen before, or maybe something they'd like to learn how to use and haven't yet. Dealing with data, this is what spends a lot of the time. Learning how to deal with data, learning how to do quality control, how to manipulate the data into the right format that they need, how to make any adjustments to the data if there's an error or something that's occurred, or maybe there's an external factor that's influencing the data they need to adjust for, visualizing the data in order to do all of these things, understanding the acquisition and the application. So they're not usually doing the acquisition themselves. This is usually a data set that the class has been given, and they have to understand, how is this set up? How was the data collected? What are the limitations that data then has, and how could it be used? And then how to form a biological question. What can you ask or what can't you ask and answer with that data set? So some data is better for some questions than others. And then there's a lot of analysis steps before we even get to writing and running code. You have to figure out what methods you're going to use and then conceptualize the project workflow. What are your inputs and outputs going to look like at each step? And do what we kind of call pseudocode sometimes, where you're outlining the different steps and functions, maybe saying, okay, this part's going to be put in a loop, and then it's going to be nested within this other loop. Then we finally get to writing and running the working code, visualizing results, and then especially communication. This can be translating within your group between people when there's a question or a problem that comes up, but also then at the end, being able to present your results to a diverse audience. So those are all the things that this course works on. And I realize we haven't even gotten to the public-private partnerships yet, but I had to give a baseline introduction to the course so you understand where our public-private pitch is going to come in. So right now, I'm going to do a quick poll question so I know kind of what to emphasize as we're going through this. The poll question is going to ask you about several different types of data and your experience or familiarity with those data types. I know this is a longer poll question, so it may take a little time. And I don't get to see your answers until you submit them, and so it will take a bit of time. That's okay. All right, looking good. Is there anyone else that wants to submit their answers real quick before I end the poll? You can just like raise your hand or something if you need some more time. Otherwise, I can share the results with you. So I know as soon as I hit share results, you won't get to input anymore. Okay, 5 seconds. Okay, here we go. Here's the results. So this is a color code at the bottom. It looks like a lot of these sort of top off at moderate, right? So we have several people for which these things are not applicable, but we range them from none to a little or moderate. Not a lot of experts in the area today. All right.
Actually, Addie, I filled out the poll and I didn't realize there was an expert category.
Maybe you had to like
it was off to the right,
off
so
the window.
I did not notice it. So
yeah, I had too many
maybe
categories,
why,
perhaps.
yeah, you don't have those. But,
so maybe you would have been an expert had you known that was an option.
Well, not necessarily, but I didn't see it. So others may not have seen it.
Yes. Okay, so it looks like we're, you know, pretty even spread throughout. Okay, I'll use that to inform my presentation. So I'll give kind of a little overview of each thing, but not go into a lot of detail. Thank you. Oh, I have to say share results. Did I do that? Okay, stop sharing. Excellent. Sorry about that. Forgot to close it. Okay, moving on. So in this course, I have first of all an example of one of the modules that we did, and then I'll kind of explain more of them. So this was a partnership that we formed with Syngenta, and I'll tell you what I found throughout the course of this project was that it was easier for me in a lot of cases to approach breeders of smaller crops rather than of major crops and major companies. And so this was actually as the sweet corn breeder, it was in their vegetable division. And they had a number of these images on trays of ears from their breeding trials. I assume that you can see where my mouse cursor is, but if not, I can make a pointer. Good, okay, yes. So these images, and they were actually a lot larger than this. This was a slide that was taken from the student's presentation itself. So the original images had background of the ground and the grass and maybe other plants and things in the background. And so the first thing they had to do is they had to crop these images. Now, I have to give you a little bit more introduction first in the way this was structured. So the way that each module in the course was structured was that we would have a breeder or a person who we considered an expert on the data itself come in and describe how it was collected, why it was collected, how they were currently using it, and then ways in which they might want to use it, and questions that were important to them. So in this case, this was Eileen Jones. I don't know if I credit her on this slide, but she was the breeder from Syngenta. She came in and discussed what was important for sweet corn, and in particular processing sweet corn. And so we had things like the taper on the ear, or the size of the ear, or different aspects that you may or may not have thought of. And a lot of students, especially the more computationally minded students, hadn't really thought about what happens with a crop in the process of processing. And in this case, so then the students were allowed to, within their groups, pick out what sort of trait they were most interested in. So this particular group decided they wanted to work on the concept of blank fill, which means how often do you have cases like this where there could have been kernels there, but they're just empty? So obviously that's not a good thing either for processing or for fresh market sweet corn, because that doesn't look good to a consumer and it diminishes the yield. So then we had someone come in that's more of an expert on the data science side. So in this case, it was Dirk Colbury. He came in from CMSE, which is our computational math science and engineering department here at MSU, and talked about image analysis and just conceptual questions around how to consider looking at pixels, what image thresholding is, what the concept of different channels of colors, and how to go about processing pipelines. So the students then built their own processing pipeline where they went from an image that was cropped down to the tray itself. I think this is a little bit of an unfair image because I think they were constrained for space on the slide. So it shouldn't have cut off the ear here, but they had an image that was cropped to the tray, and sometimes they had to adjust the skew as well. And then they managed to set up some thresholds, 2 different thresholds that would give them the total area of the kernels and then the total area of the ears. And so then by just subtracting those from each other, that gave them the blank fill. So this is just one example from one semester from this course where we partnered with a group that happened to have data that we could use. Other examples, this is from, okay, so this then was the start of our AG2PI funded project, which I will explain next. We had a project a couple of years ago called Seeding Public-Private Partnerships for AG2P Training. And as part of that, we wanted to establish some partnerships. We conducted some industry career roundtable discussions, and then generated and implemented course modules as resources that emphasize these collaborations and partnerships. So there were 3 of us involved here. Tammy and Jyoti are both involved in impacts a lot, but also know a lot more about the education side of things itself. I'm not actually trained per se in education research, and so they were very helpful, especially for certain modules. I'm not going to talk about the roundtables, but we do actually have a couple of those recorded that are available publicly. And so if you are interested in hearing some career roundtable discussions, you can copy those links real quick, and then you can go watch those. One of those was with Bayer Crop Sciences, and the other one was with the MSU Tech Transfer Team. So not a public, not a industry group per se, but it focuses a lot on the concepts of tech transfer. Okay, so now the spring 2022 modules, the following year, we did another sweet corn one with Syngenta just because they had lots of data they wanted us to look at. This was an interesting one because they had images of canned corn dumped out in a tray. And what they were interested in was cases where the kernels changed colors after sitting out. So the idea here was if you were a restaurant that had a buffet and you had cans of corn you wanted to have on your buffet, how long could they sit out before they start turning gray? I know that sounds disgusting, but it is actually a trait that they have to consider and breed for. So we were working on how to quantify that color change. The pictures are of canned corn immediately after being dumped out and then after an hour of sitting out. The second module that year, we actually took a rover down to a field in Ohio that was the Weaver popcorn field trials, and we drove the rover through and collected data. And then the class got this LiDAR data that they were using to estimate plant height, stem diameter, lodging propensity, which is how often the plants fall over, and yield. So we were partnering with Weaver Popcorn, but also EarthSense, which is the company that makes the rovers. And then we had a couple of external partnerships, well, one internal, one external, in terms of how to use LiDAR data to actually model and predict different traits. And this one, I have other images of this, but here you're seeing a LiDAR point cloud. So where lasers have bounced off plant objects. And the blue is the lowest elevation. So that's kind of like the ground level. And then up all the way to the red, which is sort of the top of the canopy. Initially, the students, when they had started working with the data, all they saw was a really strange dome and then a pile of stuff at the bottom. And it took them a while to figure out that when the LiDAR point clouds went out into the sky into infinity, there was an infinity value that was being reported. And so they had to first filter out all of those points so that they could actually get down to the plants themselves that were way at the bottom to zoom in. So just getting to that point, I think, was a point of pride. Another module that year, we worked with drone-based hyperspectral image cubes, which presented a lot of problems in itself. We were working actually with potato trials. So you'll notice if you know your crops, this is not potato. This is actually a maize multispectral image data set, but just used as an example. But they were extracting hyperspectral pixels of the plant canopy for the potatoes to predict disease onset and severity. So this was from Dave Douch's field trials, who's a potato breeder here at Michigan State. The trials had been flown by the RS&GIS group here, led by Aaron Bunting. And then we were also working in partnership with Microsoft Research to do some of the data analysis and learn about how to do the predictive work using those data types. And then finally, this one isn't actually an industry partnership, but I think it's really cool, so I like to talk about it. This example is from an undergraduate class here at MSU, where Tammy Long is one of the teachers, and she had had undergraduate students as part of her biology class taking pictures of trees every week for many years. So she had years and years of data on trees that were actually sort of known and referenced at MSU. And they had also collected data on how many leaves were there and how much green versus other colors were present. So it's a phenology concept, essentially. So how fast do the plants green up, and then how fast do they change colors in the fall? And the charge to the graduate students in my course was to actually generate an interactive data analysis and exploration tool that could be used as an undergraduate resource for the course. So my students took the data, organized it, put it into databases, and then added a lot of other variables like weather data, rainfall, temperature, that sort of thing. And then created an RShiny app where they could enter in the different plant species and the different years they wanted to look at. And so it created this visualization tool that was interactive. And then on top of that, they also created a lab sheet packet, actually, that went through like guided analysis and questions for the undergraduate biology course to use to help teach this tool. So that was a really cool one where it was sort of an interplay between different courses. So how did I go about seeking out these partnerships? Well, part of them, we started by approaching people that I knew and working with people that I already had some network connection to, but it expanded beyond that. And one example of the ways that I tried to gain extra partnerships was anytime I gave a presentation, I would include a slide or two about this project. And then I would say, you know, if you are interested and you're interested in partnerships, here's the ask, right? I teach this course every spring, and I can actually ask the same thing to the group of you. The course is taught every spring. So we are always interested in partnerships, whether that be with data sets that you have or data sets that are publicly available you're interested in using. And if you are a partner that has some sort of topic of interest, then I say the ask is 75 minutes of your time. Our courses are, that's the length of time of one class. So come in and explain the project. What's the data set? What are your goals with it? And then preferably come back at the end to hear the results, because it's pretty cool. If the person was providing data, then I said, you got to understand that those are going to be turned into a publicly accessible module. We're willing to anonymize stuff, so it doesn't have to be, you know, you don't have to reveal any secrets. And then if they wanted to come in more or less than that, that's great. But that was the bar. And I will say I presented this in a number of presentations, but then we also had a couple of times that were presented poster sessions on this project. And that was actually more useful, which I'll get to in a little bit. Okay, I'm a little over halfway through my time maybe. So let's get into the partnerships in research. Again, these are sort of case studies, and then Delia is going to get into how you can actually do this. And the next poll question is going to be launched now. And this one's going to ask you whether you have pursued any public-private partnerships of any type, whether that's research or education or anything else. And you only get to have one answer, so it should be a lot quicker.
Eddie, you have about 15 more minutes, but
Okay.
hopefully we can have some time for questions as part of that also. So.
Oh, sure. I can make it quick, don't worry. Okay, 10 more seconds. You only have to push one thing, so. All right, here are the results. So it looks like quite a few people have successful partnerships formed. Some have attempted, but have not quite formed them yet. Not attempted, but have interest. It's good that no one said not interested, because otherwise I would question why you're in this presentation, but okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, my example case study, my primary case study here is going to be centered around tar spot. And again, I'm going to give you a really brief introduction. This is a new disease that's caused by the pathogen Phylochoromatus. It's a fungi, its host is maize, spread by wind and water, and causes these raised shiny black lesions. It thrives in humid conditions, not necessarily cool actually, but spreads quickly. It can cause up to 40% yield loss. So this disease has been around for 100 years in Central and South America, but as of 2015, it was new to the upper Midwest. And so you can see these different types of lesions that it causes, and it reduces photosynthetic capacity as it covers the leaves. It breaks down the canopy really quickly, and it makes the stalks less strong. So it causes a lot of lodging. It can very quickly break down a canopy. So big problem. We started by looking for resistance. So we started screening diversity panels and taking ratings, and we formed a USDA-funded project out of this, which was awesome and successful. And we actually have started the second project at this point. But I'm just going to give you a little background. So we started backcrossing our resistant lines and developing new populations. And as a result of this, we've formed a lot of public-private partnerships. One around sort of improving detection and of onset and severity. So I'm showing again an example of how we might use different phenotypes to connect to genotypes to make breeding decisions. But the specific question here, we were interested in using cell phone imagery to train a machine learning algorithm to identify the spots, and not just, you know, numbers of spots, but then percent coverage. Because we were doing all of this by hand, and it takes a long time, and it's pretty, you know, we do a lot of training, but there's still an amount of subjectivity. So we thought if we could get some sort of app that could determine those sorts of traits, it would be great. And to do this, we actually partnered with Bayer Crop Sciences. This is a case where there was an open call through the Bayer Grants for Ag program. So there's a number of open call sort of programs where you can apply and pitch your idea to an industry group. And that's a way to form partnerships if you don't have any network or anyone to work with directly. So we were a successful Grants for Ag awardee, and that led us into that sort of area of research. But that's not the only way that you can form partnerships. And I'm listing out some ideas here, some of which we've used successfully, some of which we haven't, but just, brainstorming off the top of my head. So there are times that sometimes industry group will come to campus or set up a remote sort of meet and greet scenario. And that might be just with your lab, or it might be potentially multiple relevant PI groups. And they're basically sort of fishing for partners, whether that's on a particular topic, or maybe they have a broad range of topics they're interested in pursuing. It's kind of like speed dating, right? So you put your best foot forward and say, here's the kind of things we're interested in, and see if there's a match. Field days and visits are another one. I know, at least in the plant sciences, probably other groups as well, there's cases where we will bring in stakeholders or other groups to come and visit the field and learn about the research that's going on. But you could just as easily get in touch with some industry groups and invite them as well. I've had a lot of luck actually at conferences, again, using posters or just meeting up with people, giving talks, and then that forms kind of the communication that you need. And then use your network, right? Leverage the friends or the collaborators that you have. So I have just some general advice here. One is that it works to develop a relationship with someone first. So approach your developed relationships first. And then consider a specific versus a general ask. In my case, I've done it both ways, but in the case of the educational modules, I had pretty specific ideas for how we might engage. And I knew that was important at the time because educational partnerships was not really something I had heard a lot about people using. And so in this case, I think to trigger the imagination of the people I was asking, it was helpful to say, here's what we're doing, here's some examples, and here's specific ways that I would like to have you involved. And then that helped them wrap their heads around what it was I was even trying to ask. The other way that you can do this is you could have a range of options and ideas for engagement. I've heard that you like kind of a menu or something, but here's some different ways that I'm interested in engaging or different topics, and then what that would look like. Obviously point out the interests and the benefits, and then be clear about the commitments for what you're asking. Also keep it short. Don't send like a 15-page proposal. This is like a short ask. Anything one-on-one is going to work better than like a mass communication type of approach. I did show you the example of the slide that I used, but that was more just in terms of getting the word out, which comes into this point here. I think repeated exposure is particularly helpful. So if somebody was sitting in an audience where they heard me say, hey, I'm looking for partnerships, and then I went and approached that person later one-on-one, they'd say, oh yeah, I heard about this before. This sounds really interesting, right? Okay, last poll question. I'm almost done. And this is going to be actually a short answer question, which I know is complicated. If you prefer, we could just have this as part of our discussion. It's a pretty small group. So the question is, if you've had successful partnerships, what made them work well? If you've not, what prevented their success or pursuit? So if you are the sort of person that likes to speak about your experiences, you're welcome to talk when we start the Q&A session. But if you, for whatever reason, don't want to say your answer, then you can type it in here and we can read it anonymously. I'll give you about another 20 seconds to think about it, and then we will move on to our question and answers. 5 seconds. I see a few answers popping up. And I'm going to end it. Okay, if you didn't get the chance, then you can speak. This is interesting because I don't actually see the answers. Do you guys see the text that was entered?
I just see what I entered.
Addie, if you press the view details, it should pop up in a internet window
I don't actually
browser.
see view details.
Okay, maybe I can only see them. Do you want me to just read them?
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
Sorry about that. See, we're learning because none of us have used these polls before, but okay. So here's the 3 answers. One is super simple, trust.
Ooh, nice.
The answer. Okay. No partnerships. I don't quite know if my work is applicable. And the third one is industry initiating a partnership with public researchers, common topic of interest to both.
Nice. Yeah, those are all 3 good answers. Food for thought. So that leads us into, if I can get my screen back. Oh, okay. I have some acknowledgements and then questions. And we can have some discussion now. You can email me later if you'd rather, whatever works.
Okay, thank you very much, Addie. Very, very useful information and interesting to see how you've been able to build those partnerships and both on the research side and the education side. So we have a small group, so if you have any questions, just speak up or raise your hand or put them in the chat. And I'll start. So with the educational partnership, what's your sense of what's the what's the hesitation, or what's the major hesitation that companies have? Is it time commitment, or is it confidentiality of information? That what is the
no, it's a great
who are
question.
not interested? What's the main reason?
It's a great question, and I think the main reason that I heard for hesitation was around confidentiality, especially as companies get sort of bought by larger companies. There's oftentimes overarching policies in place about data sharing. And so the idea of having a data set that would be shared and then made public, and it was like a non-starter, right? So I think that was the biggest thing. I don't think time became an issue at the onset. I think time was sometimes an issue for once people were engaged, that was kind of a limitation on how much they could be engaged, right? So I had some groups that they'd provide a data set and maybe answer some questions and do an initial thing, but then couldn't really engage it all beyond that, or they expressed interest in participating, but then couldn't at some point just because it gets busy, right? And so I think timing and busyness comes into play, but the major reason for the non-start was around data sharing. I did have some companies say, well, if we could identify a data resource that's already public and we had questions about that, we'd be happy to work with that. So that's another way we could have done it. Rex, do you have a question?
Yes. I was trying to figure out what the point here is. Is the point to have a learning experience for the students, or is the point to develop a public-private partnership so you can drop names?
It was more for the students in this case. So because this would be relevant current data sets from a company, they got some insight into what sort of data was being generated, what questions were being asked, how things are considered in industry. It's different than in a public institution breeding program oftentimes. So there's different considerations and different ways of approaching things. So just the exposure to an industry group, these are probably going to be future employers of a lot of these students. And then the part I didn't mention actually is that as part of this impacts NRT program, the students were required, the funded students were required to do internships in industry. And so this also set up some interaction between the industry and the students. And if there was a student that was interested in a particular aspect of one of the industry projects, they could then be placed on internship to continue work on that project. So, and then some of them actually got placed in jobs in the future in industry groups. So it was partly about the interaction, but a lot about student education and exposure to what's going on in sort of the real world.
That's a good point about
it
was a good point about the students connecting with them with the companies, because I could see that as a big attraction for the companies, is that they get to connect to students who maybe they can employ in the future.
Yeah, they love that.
Yeah. Other questions, anybody? I have one more. I was thinking, this is, of course, you coming from the plant side, it's the course you described is obviously directed towards plant sciences, but is there any reason why it could not be expanded to other fields, animal science, microbiology?
I think anyone in any field. And I will say that my initial conceptualization for the course itself came from Eric Lyons at University of Arizona, who was doing something kind of similar. His was mostly computational students, but they were working to solve current relevant problems across any field. So one that I remember was they worked with like an astronomist and a physicist to map some sort of distant star or something. So anything that had a computational aspect with the problem, and then they were partnering with people who had problems and people who could solve problems, right? And so that was my initial idea, actually came from his course. So yeah, I mean, you could apply the concepts of project-based learning and public-private partnerships, either or both, to any field.
Yeah. Well, certainly the first part of the course that you described, the foundational aspects, applies to animal science too. Now, of course, then when you get into the later modules, you may have to, get different connections with industry, but different partners, but the principles are the same. So.
Yeah, and in fact, some of the people we partnered with actually work with animal scientists as well. So Dan Morris was a name that I brought up who worked with us on LiDAR, but he does image-based tracking of pigs and chickens and whatnot as well. So yeah.
Okay, good. Any final question for Eddie? If not, then no, Eddie will stay on, so we may have some questions later on that can also be directed to her. But turn it over now to Nadelia Gomez from Iowa State, and she's going to talk about public-private partnerships in commercialization. So, Nadelia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to your group today. It is delightful. I think back to my own time starting off as a plant breeder and geneticist at the University of Minnesota and thinking, man, I never got trained on these things that Addie and Tammy and Yoti are training. And so this is fantastic. I'm very, very happy that this is already happening. As was mentioned before, I am the Chief Technology Officer for the Digital and Precision Ag Bioscience Platform. This is an inaugural role at Iowa State University, one that connects faculty with a path to commercialize scientific breakthrough. And my focus in particular is on digital and precision agriculture. That has been part of my background, and you'll learn a little bit about that as I go through my presentation. But there are others like me that focus on other areas that the state of Iowa has deemed really important for long-term growth in the state. And those other areas include bio-based products, vaccines and immunotherapies, and medical devices. So these roles of chief technology officers embedded inside the vice presidents of research inside a university are precisely to help faculty address some of these questions. How do I go about creating these public-private partnerships that can help my science finally have societal impact? And this societal impact, of course, is broader than just selling products or providing new services. There are a variety of spaces that require multidisciplinary activity, and crossing those silos is sometimes very challenging. So If I can't answer all of the questions today, know that these are roles that are new, that there is an evolution towards getting more faculty involved in these public-private partnerships. And if you want to follow up later on, here's my email. Make sure to reach out. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I would love to create connections with you and discuss this. This is a passion of mine. And it's a passion because, you know, it's not easy. That's the thing. Dr. Andrew Jones, in a YouTube video that he has made available about university industry collaborations, in his case, he says, this is not easy. It's not easy, and you are not trained to do this, but it will be worth it. And I would totally agree on the concept of you're not trained to do this, really. And each case is very different. So first question that I want to ask the audience, just to kind of get a sense of our background. Whoops. Let's see. Can you please help me with the first one? Nicole, it seems like I can't reach it. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Okay, so let's take a look at the first question. Thinking about this concept of whether we're trained to do this or not, give me an idea of what your career experience has been. Have you worked primarily in academia? Have you worked primarily in corporate settings? And then I've got this one last category there, if you've worked in both. And what we're seeing here right now is answers that are very much in line with what is expected. We have a variety of individuals that have worked in academia, some in corporate settings, but so far from the results I'm seeing, there are none that have actually worked in both. And that is not unusual. It's very difficult if you look at the pathways that we have for career opportunities, especially if you are in very narrow areas of expertise. You'll probably go in one direction or the other. So this space where you're sharing academia and corporate activities is very difficult. And there's just a few of us that have had the fortune, I guess, of working in that space. But if you are a person who's interested in this, Addie has started making those attempts to cross over that gap, and other faculty members that show an interest in making that gap smaller between academia and industry, there is definitely a lot of opportunity for you. So one reason to pursue this is professional development, making sure that you have gained the experience of how to work across that line. I remember when I was working at DuPont Pioneer, I was working on a new digital software solution. We were going to deliver crop modeling predictions through digital devices. And DuPont Pioneer announced a very large collaboration with 8 land-grant universities. This was a great learning experience. And I think it's important to keep in mind that even though you're in academia and have always worked in academia, these partnerships might be difficult and complex. But if you're in corporate, you have different roles also in corporate. And so making these connections can also have specific challenges. Later on, I had the opportunity to lead the Iowa Agritech Accelerator. Jack mentioned that I had experience with startup companies. This is one of the examples where I had to see another perspective of it. No longer was I working within one company, but now I had to see what several companies wanted in terms of innovation. And although this particular example was not directly associated with a university setting, many of these companies that had this experience on innovation later on went to strengthen their relationship with a local university because they said, we want to be connected to that pipeline of talent. We want to be connected to that pipeline of new ideas to help the commercialization process. Strictly speaking, public-private partnerships are established through contractual agreements where there are defined roles, responsibilities, an assessment of risk, who's sharing what, how are we doing this, and there are public and private partners involved. So strictly speaking, the university industry partnership is one example of a public-private partnership. And when I speak in this context about university industry partnership, I encompass the full suite of interactions between academic and corporate representatives. Addie showed us one of those examples. I'm illustrating here a couple of stick figures. You might meet these individuals at a conference, maybe at a networking event. In the digital precision ag space, our role is in the bioscience platforms is facilitating these connections. I think Addie mentioned the matchmaking part. Looking for those connections is important, and that's often the start. And as pointed out by the example, that's a transactional model. You've got one project or two partners, very specific data sets. As Addie pointed out very well, you have to have a short, precise ask. And that is usually where those partnerships start. But the suite of interactions can go all the way to highly complex relationship-based models where you're thinking long-term objectives and you're including what's my path for talent recruitment. Maybe there's the HR component of the corporate setting that's also reaching out and figuring out, how do I let other people know about this? There might be new innovations that they cannot tackle within the corporate setting that they're saying, I would like to seed these new ideas and see where that goes. It's too risky for us to take on alone as a corporate entity, but we want to see this happen. And even at the level of a state, like the creation of the roles that the CTOs have in ISU, these roles are about economic development, trying to say, what are the areas that are going to give the workforce high-paying jobs for the future? So we talked about how it starts off with those students' experiences with the companies understanding real-life problems, and then this is a different type of approach. So when I'm talking about university industry partnerships in this conversation, I'm looking at the breadth, the entire scope of these types of interactions. I'm going to have a look here at the second poll question. See, go back. So the next question is on commercialization process. And I want you to think about the amount of time that you invest in funding, obtaining funding for your research, doing the research, doing publication, if you're involved in the launch of new products or the testing of new products, and then how much of your time is involved in societal impact, and in your thoughts.
Nadia, we don't see the poll yet.
Oh, let's see. Yeah, this is new to me. I do not have a way to launch it.
Nicole, can you launch it?
It's not letting me here.
All right, maybe
Okay.
Maybe I have to.
Oh, there
You got it.
I got it.
Now we see it. Yeah.
One of the papers I was reading in preparation for this talk really emphasized how often we think of our work in terms of societal impact. Everyone from corporate side and from academia. Corporates have core values, mission statements. Feeding the world is one that I very much resonated with me at the very beginning of my own career. And in both areas, we're thinking about that societal impact. How we deliver that, how we get that information out is really different. And we play different roles in the process. And so it is really important to think about that entire process from idea out to a new product or service, having many of us play different roles in that process. And so if you are primarily thinking about funding, as is the example here in our poll, the question would be, how do I contextualize this university industry partnership in the context of getting more funding? And if you spend a lot of time in your research, maybe some of the questions that you'd be interested in are thinking about, how can I advance this research? Who somebody asked in the question before, I don't know if my research is applicable to university industry partnerships. And so exploring these opportunities in the context of a university industry partnership, as Addie pointed out in her case study, helps you hone in exactly what it is that you want out of that partnership. But you have to also keep in mind that the other partner, the non-public partner, the private partner, is also thinking about their needs, and they're coming to the table with concerns that might be around publication, data sharing, how much of this information is being shared with my competitors. All of this is extremely important. So in the commercialization process, in order to be able to have this evolution into a relationship-based model, you have to think about how all the different stakeholders are engaged in the transformation of that idea all the way into a new product or a new service or a new business. And this is where the complexity starts to show up. Because not only are we dealing with a spectrum of interactions from a one-to-one relationship with one individual in an organization, but now you're starting to realize that you might have an entire collection of interactions, not including just R&D, but including the business unit and maybe even the legal unit of a company when you're trying to create these partnerships. So let me talk a little bit about some examples of these partnerships, and you'll see most of them are described in this simplified diagram. They're never this simple, of course, but take an example of industry-sponsored research, or you have a specific connection with someone that you know, and Addie illustrated that beautifully. You might have one person that you're connecting with in an R&D unit, or maybe a person that shows up at your poster session. You're interested in that data exchange. Maybe you're interested in that knowledge exchange. They are too, and they're also looking for the student experience. Sometimes the companies realize that there is a technology that you are presenting at that conference, and they're saying, I know exactly how that could fit in one of my product development pipelines. And so the technology transfer becomes evident. And this opens up funding opportunities, of course, to be able to start making that interaction. Now, I want to ask a question quickly for those of you that have experience with the industry. How big are the companies that you work with, or that you have partnered with, or that you're a part of? So is it 1 to 50 employees? Is it 50 to 350? Or are they very large companies? And I think about Addie's, for example, Microsoft Research, Syngenta. These are very large entities. And so in some cases, folks that have experience with small companies know that if you find one person interested in your technology or wanting to make a connection with your students, you could probably very quickly in that small company from that R&D unit have very clear access to the business unit. And you might be able to move along that industry university relationship model out to a relationship model in a long-term objective very quickly. But in some cases, that's not the case. In some cases, the companies that we work with are very small. They are very, they might have a limited number of individuals that can actually interact with you. It might be difficult to get their engagement, and they might be trying to raise funds for their own company. So the size of the company and the concept of partnerships being one size fits all is very difficult. Another thing that was mentioned earlier in the conversation in the previous presentation is that the companies are now reaching out to universities and saying, here is my big problem, help me solve it, right? And the horizon might be 10 years or 20 years out. Usually those problems require immense interdisciplinarity. And in a decentralized system like the university setting, it might be very difficult to know what your colleagues are doing. If you're in the College of Engineering, what is happening over on the side of agriculture? If you're on the side of design, what's happening over on livestock? So I think it's really important to understand that the one-size-fits-all approach for these types of industry-sponsored research is not the perfect solution. You have to have some flexibility for interacting in these partnerships if your companies are very small that you're partnering with, or that they're very large, and understanding what are the consequences of that. If you take that one element, just an industry university engagement, and you broaden it out even more, now it's no longer just one principal investigator working with a unit or a data set. Now we're talking about university industry engagement that is trying to co-create R&D collaborations. Usually they are thinking not only about funding opportunities that are coming from the corporate into the university, but you also have funding opportunities for user-driven or user-inspired research. And that's where the societal impact starts to have more of a resonance with both partners. They're thinking, how can I really get this idea and transform what's commercially available right now? And these types of engagements also give room for innovation and entrepreneurship. There are many companies that have a venture arm or an investment arm, and they are looking for new innovations to invest in. It's really interesting that sometimes they invest in things where the mothership might not necessarily put a lot of resources. For example, we have some poultry companies that have created venture arms and are then funding projects and new enterprises, new innovations in the space of alternative proteins. And you'd wonder, why is that the case? And that's because from the perspective of industry, that time window, 10 years, 20 years in the future, is where that university industry engagement starts to make value for them. They're saying, I'm going to try to seed these ideas, co-create R&D collaborations, even if start creating the coursework that I will need for my talent that I'm going to hire in 10 years from now. It starts to get a little bit more complicated when you add more than one company to the mix. And these have become very popular, industry consortia. These are challenging. The others are challenging too, but this one poses a next level element of challenge. It becomes really difficult now to prioritize the high risk projects. Yes, you gain a lot of options for commercialization, because if company one says, I'm going to pass on that, I'm going to close down my digital ag division, I'm not interested, company two could still run with it. But the problem here is that the prioritization and the multi-year aspect of these interactions can be quite complex. Another thing to keep in mind about these industry consortia is how important it is to have internal champions in your corporate friends. So your corporate partners might have one person that's super adamant, a plant breeder that says, this is the future, I'm going to invest all my time in it. But that individual has to go and speak to another person on the business unit and say, look, it is worth our time and money to be part of this industry consortia. And so as university individuals, faculty, we're going to want to be sensitive to what type of information does my partner on the side of corporate need to be able to echo their message through their entire organization. And they're volunteers in many of these advisory boards. And so you have to really have the support of their supervisors and their line of reporting structure in order to see what is the value for this beyond their professional development. So this is a really interesting thing, but I think it opens up a lot of funding opportunities. There are a lot of federal grants that are now moving into trying to create this combination of basic and applied research. And then you get to the mega level of public-private partnerships, where perhaps you are engaging economic development entities, you've got universities involved in it, you might have large and small companies and even investment firms saying, where is the future of our region? What other activities do we need to have here in order to help grow this space? This is a beautiful space to be in if you're really interested in societal impact of your scientific breakthroughs. Very often, this is the part where some of our silos around financially driven gains versus public goods starts to meld into really interesting and creative ways. Workforce development, you're not only thinking about what are the careers and the courses of the future, but you're also thinking about where are you going to get the people that are going to be trained in these areas. And of course, the diversification of funding opportunities increases. If the corporate isn't interested in taking that new innovation and making it part of their R&D activities, maybe there's a startup that's willing to spin off. And the talent for global engagement is very, very high. So the other important thing about these particular types of interactions is that there is a very powerful role of universities and of corporate partners in policy and regulation. So it helps start to think, if I am creating this new innovation that's going to transform the agricultural system or the way that we produce meat in the future, what do I need to have in order to move in that direction? What incentives, what reward systems for our farmers and growers? Now you have much more involvement of that long-term vision that will increase the adoption of that technology or innovation that you're working with. Now, not only do we have all of these different types of university industry partnerships that start off from one-on-one transactional interactions all the way to long-term relational models, but we also have these other changes that are affecting the dynamic of this. For several years, the amount of investment in R&D that we're seeing from businesses has kept on increasing relative to federal government and non-federal government, nonprofit, higher education. And that means that universities are reaching out and saying, hey, business partners, what can we help you with? At the same time, there's a period of time around 2008 or so, a little bit before, where many R&D units of corporate entities were actually decreasing their investment in basic research. Yes, we're going to put more money, but we're going to put it towards the later stages of testing of a new product. And so when that's happening, you create the space for the interaction between your university counterparts and your industry partners to come together. Another evolution that has been occurring is that in the past, the corporates would go and check what's on your list of new technologies, and then reach out and say, I'm interested in this one. I can see that Dr. So-and-so is the innovator. Let's go and work with them. But now they're seeding early stage research and they're going to co-create what they need for the future. They have a market in mind. We have served this group. Now we're going to move over to this area, or our consumers are changing their interest for what and how they eat. And so we're going to move into this direction and they're going to seed that activity. What is more palatable for them as they think about the final product of food, fuel, feed, whatever it is that they're working on. So that's really a trend too. I'm going to also point out that in the past, we would have these corporate R&D units kind of co-located with university settings. And those types of interactions were more serendipitous because it was easier to show up and hear a conference from a professor and see what it is that's going on in that poster session. But in a post-pandemic world where the remote worker is actually much more popular and there's a change in the desire of what your global talent might be, we no longer have that emphasis on the proximity as strongly as we used to have them before. So if you are a faculty member thinking about how do I create that university industry partnership, it's going to be a little bit difficult to just rely on those in-person interactions. All of the mechanisms that we've learned post-pandemic around virtual settings is going to be really important. And how do you maintain those communities in those virtual settings is also challenging. Two last things that are trends that are affecting university industry partnerships. Open innovation, open science, the requirement of funding agencies to disclose who your investors or where the money is coming from or who are your partners. All of these things are still happening right now. They're not settled in stone. None of these are. In fact, trends come and go, and we have to be aware of how those are going to affect the likelihood of those partnerships. So if things start to tighten up in terms of information disclosure, your industry partners might be a little bit more hesitant because they're watching and seeing where the trend will go. If there is a concern about open innovation in terms of, I'm going to post a quest or a challenge out there and anybody can solve it, that also creates a larger pool for the corporate to partner, and then it might not be as exciting or interesting to go to your local university and make that partnership with them. So you've got to think about all those trends that are happening, or if you're not the one thinking about it, at least work with the other folks that are in your university settings or in your corporate environments to understand who is managing that interaction across that border. Regardless, wherever you're starting, I think it's really important, if you're just starting off thinking about pros and cons of these types of interactions, here are a couple of common biases or common ideas that people have when they're trying to evaluate, should I get involved in this or not? Many academics say, yes, I'm going to have a greater chance of having my scientific breakthrough go out there. Somebody's going to pick up my new methodology. They're going to utilize it and make it available to the rest of the world. That's awesome. My students are going to have more opportunities. I'm going to get increased funding from my corporate partners, and I'm going to be able to be eligible for federal grants that require this sort of collaboration. On the other hand, it takes time, and it also creates this sense of, well, I don't know if they're really going to fund my research because they want to really be working on products, and I'm somewhere more theoretical, right? And so those are questions that are real and people are concerned about, and these are decisions that they're making about whether they should or shouldn't interact in those industry partnerships. One of the things, though, that I hear very often, and we've heard it a little bit before too in our conversation, is I'm going to have limited opportunities for publication because I cannot share the data or I can't share the results. And so I want to ask the audience quickly here if you think that that is true or false. So let me go back again and see if I can activate the poll again. There you go. Is it harder to publish?
Sorry, we don't see it yet.
Okay. Mine says launched. And I have one person, 3 people that are answering.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe it's me. I got disconnected and had to connect back on. So maybe something. Okay. Just keep going.
The question is it harder to publish industry-sponsored research? True or false? And we've got right now a 60-40 split. This is definitely a topic that I would love to hear more about, because more and more publications are coming out with a co-author type scenario with both industry and universities. And it, of course, depends on the journal and the type of research you're doing. But the previous concerns about this is really difficult or not is, it's changing. These are trends that you have to take a look at. Janet asks the question, is this more for academia? Well, I don't know. I really think that corporates also are very diverse. We think of corporates as very homogeneous, but in reality, there are R&D divisions within corporate institutions, within corporations, that are very eager to share the results of their research and their studies. And so I have been when I was part of corporate, I have been part of some publications as well. So I would say that this is a question that's valid for both sides. And what I notice is that there is an increased interest and possibility for co-authored publications And the concept of it's very difficult to publish industry-sponsored research is not as tough as it was before. Google, for example, is a big proponent of publishing a lot of information. So, Janet, you want to say a few words?
Excuse me. Yes, I just thought, since I'm in corporate world, maybe I just have a different perspective, and I don't know how much of my perspective is just unique to me and my situation, but perhaps I thought maybe it was relevant to make a comment. So I work for a company, Highline International, which is a poultry breeding company, but really I'm a primary researcher. So I collaborate with different universities, and I've always said to my bosses, if we're going to collaborate with academia, they're doing stuff for us, we're doing stuff for them. I mean, these are true joint collaborations. We've collaborated a lot with Jack, so he can attest to this. But I've always said that if we're going to have a true collaboration where both sides are providing an input, then we need to recognize that academia gets basically paid or supported by publications, and so that we need to allow publications. And so that's how I've been able to get collaborations that have actually been published. And there's stuff that I do with less collaborations, but I still publish them because I think it's important that if you do science, answering questions, but you don't publish it, then you might as well have not have done it, because then nobody ever knows, right? And it doesn't move the field forward. So I've done that as well, but I recognize that not all corporate companies have that same sort of philosophy. So I just wanted to put in my 2 cents worth from my perspective on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Janet. I appreciate that you jumped in. This makes my day, because I know that people are then interested in what I'm saying and following on the conversation. Janet, you're absolutely right. The experience is diverse in different types of companies. And I think that anytime we put up these pros and cons and general myths, and you have to understand that this is not a one size fits all at all. And I think it's wonderful that there are researchers within companies like yourself that are advocates for the importance of publication and pushing the needle by making this information peer-reviewed and sharing it with the rest of the world. So kudos, this is phenomenal, and also speaks very highly of programs like AG2PI, because we're trying to create these collaborations and we're trying to recognize what is important to the other partner. If you're in industry, what's important to your colleagues that are in the university setting. So wonderful. Thank you so much, Janet, for participating and sharing with your perspective. Now, Janet, I'd like to pick your brain on this one. This is what I hear often about the side of the corporates. And one of the things that they say is, oh, universities are so slow, they're bureaucratic. Yes, we're going to get access to a lot of talent. That's going to be great. These students in Addie's class are genius. We love them. They also think about better products and services, because if they have that sort of connection with what's coming up in the future, they can amplify the impact of their R&D. But they also think about, well, faculties are hard to work with. They might not know how to market themselves. Sometimes they talk for hours about this one little specific thing, and I need to be able to translate it to impact. One of the things that I often hear is, I am going to sacrifice my first mover advantage. How many of you know what first mover advantage is? This is the concept of, if you are the industry that shows up with the first product, you're going to gain the biggest, most impactful piece of that market. And so I'm going to really quickly ask, because now I know that there are some industry folks in the audience. Let's go back and see if we can demystify this first mover advantage. The concept of being first to market, increasing my probabilities of success if you're a corporate partner. So tell me, true or false, is this documented? Is it true that this first to market increases the probability of success for corporate partners? I'm going to give you some time. I've got 4 answers so far. And again, if there's someone else in the audience that wants to chime in, just please do so as well. This is really interesting that we have members on both sides. So according to our audience, it is true that being the first to market increases the probability of success of corporate partners. Well, I am going to let you know that there is no specific, undeniable, irrefutable story around this. There's actually equal number of examples where the invention was first delivered by one company, and then it was a different one that was able to refine it and get it well done and reliable, that then is able to get the market. And so this concept, if you're a corporate and you're kind of holding on to, I don't want to share my ideas with anyone, I don't want to be in an industry consortia, because if I say too much about what we're doing, my competitor over there might actually move fast on something. Most of the time, the research on this topic shows that first to market is not the winners takes it all kind of idea. And so I'm going to stop sharing here this one, and I'm going to go to the chat. I think, yes, Janet, tell us your comment. Go ahead, Janet.
Okay, so one of the things that I stress to my company when I'm looking to establish a collaboration is that if we're collaborating on a project, it means that they're utilizing our genetics. And so what that says, or the advantage there, is that we know that whatever they're doing is relevant to our genetics. And we will know this advantage 2 or 3 or 4 years ahead of our competitors, and we will know that whatever they're doing is relevant to us, rather than using some obscure chicken breeds where it's not really relevant to any commercial birds. So I think that I push that as an advantage, and I think that would fit in with the first mover advantage philosophy there. Okay.
You have highlighted something super important, Janet. In your case, you recognize that there is a first mover advantage, but it is not a negative that drives then the decision about to collaborate. You actually say, yes, first mover advantage is important, and we want to use our genetics in these studies so that we are better informed about what that is. And so that is a fantastic way to highlight these pros and cons. Pros and cons, as seen in this sort of binomial type table, just have the yes and the no. But in reality, as are any of these relationship models, these are about understanding that these are different of perspectives, whether it's publication emphasis, whether it is the need for, what's the difference in our appetite for timelines, what is our acceptance of the levels of publications and non-disclosure agreements. These are not problems to solve. These are paradigms to manage. This is going to be intrinsic in every type of university industry collaboration. And if you have champions that are inside corporate advocating for saying, yes, our breeding, our genetics is important to be in that study because we will know first before we launch this product, then the same idea of, oh, we can't share this information because we have to be first to market, becomes the motivator for saying, let me find a trusted partner in a university setting to work on this so that we can be advised on how to approach this ahead of time before a failure happens. So not a problem to solve. These differences are paradigms to manage. And whenever you're entering into this university industry collaboration, you're going to want to put the lenses of your partner and understand what is important for them. And they are all in different positions. It might be education, it might be research, it might be their interest for their students, they're looking for funding, they're interested in publications. It might be all the other types of complexities that are there. So these are challenges that can also become opportunities to grow these partnerships. The winners that are going to partner successfully, those partnerships that are going to transform science and products and services and businesses, are the ones that are able to find this balance of co-creation. Where are we located? Can we effectively use remote systems? This concept of public messages, best practices, policies, regulations. I had a very interesting university industry partnership being explored. And one of the partners said, well, I'm not so sure that I can partner with you, university, because on some part of your departments, they're talking about the negative effects of my business, right? And so the interesting thing is that the conception of the image of the company needs to also be in light of this evolution of new research. If you have an advocate within that company that's able to say, look, it's important for us to be at the table to better understand how our company can become better, that's also incredibly valuable. So challenges become opportunities when you have the right partners using the filters that can see from the other perspective and say, if publications are important to you, for me, this is what's important. How do we ensure that our terms allow for both of these things to be addressed? It is very, very difficult. And keep in mind, too, that if you have these trusted relationships with individuals, they're important to nurture, they're important to build upon, but they will also have to face the larger context of their organizations. Sometimes you build very good, strong relationships with one individual, leadership changes within university or industry or government, and you've got to find yourself having to do this all over again. If you move closer to that relational model of interactions, you might be bringing value, benefits on both sides. And those relationships can be much more enduring than one-off interactions. So very many reasons for continuing that evolution of the university industry. So I'm going to go now quickly into recommendations, a couple of ideas. Obviously, I have shown you a whole bunch of different types of partnerships, and I've talked about some of them being so complex. I don't want you to be scared about this. These are important parts. So wherever you're at, take a couple of these recommendations and figure out, what can I do next, right? So one thing that I would say is, if you don't have one already, establish a formal retrospective process for checking in, monitoring, how is this relationship going? If you are on the transactional side, that's okay. Janet and Jack can have a conversation on the phone. How's it going? Are we still online? This is great. But as your organization and your interactions are larger, I think you're going to want to have all of those different partners at the table to make sure that you have a system for checking that. You can take this if you have worked on the software industry. Software industry has developed these practices. There's a scrum master, there's usually a program manager or someone that's calling this group together. And yes, think of it as a director of an orchestra. These program managers or scrum team leaders, these are the folks that are trying to make sure that every expert in their own industry or instrument, in the band, in the orchestra, are aligned and working together. You might be a great pianist, but you need to have a fantastic director of that orchestra to bring it all together. Make sure that you have some formal retrospective process to check in, not on the technology, not on the great funding that you got, but on the real, genuine, how are we doing this? Are we doing it right? What should we change in order to move towards that relational base? Second one, keep in mind the valley of death. If you haven't heard about the valley of death has been described in so many different ways. Sometimes it has resources, maybe it's funding if it's a company, but in general, it's this space when the resources available for pure research start to decline and the resources available for commercialization are still farther away. So now you've got a gap. How do you invest in that area in things that might have a potential, but you don't really know if it's going to work or not? So that valley of death is really when these university industry partnerships become really important, because the shallower the valley of death, the more likely it is that that scientific breakthrough can make it to the next. So you have to discuss what is their collaboration like to bolster the resources right at that stage. If it's finishing research, my graduate student is ending, and now what? How do we continue this to make sure that we find a way to make this idea into a product or a service? Strengthen your negotiation skills. Nobody taught me this when I was a plant breeder and geneticist student, but I think it's super important. And I saw it many times in the industry side. When we were evaluating partnerships with industry, we'd look for something like this. In this particular article, those 4 elements are described here. What's the transformative potential of this product, or the novelty of the product itself? Will be able to exceed that threshold required by the future marketplace. Know your market, understand who the users might be. If you are in the science and leadership team, make sure that you bring in other folks that have expertise in a variety of entrepreneurial experiences. That might mean if I'm a faculty and I'm trying to move this forward to industry, maybe I need to bring in a colleague from the marketing side and surrender my idea in its baby phase to evolve it into what it might be, into a more palatable, business-oriented proposal. Think about the killer experiment. The killer experiment is not the experiment that you can keep on going and going and going to understand the why and the next why and the next why. The killer experiment is the one that tells you really what are the risks with my particular product or my particular new idea that I'm trying to put forth. That way, the money invested in doing that experiment is going to give you a result that will still help you redirect or pivot your product. And so that's something that we do very often. We need to be able to contextualize as faculty, as academicians, as academics. We need to contextualize to the business partner what is the learning that we're going to get out of this, even if this experiment were completely to flop. That is an important component in making that industry collaboration more effective. And then the last term is understand the deal terms. Sometimes you might not be able to do that, but if there's an office of commercialization, or if there are other experienced entrepreneurs or folks that have had established meetings with industry and are working effectively in those partnerships, look at what they've done and compare it with the terms of your particular engagement, and make sure that maybe there's a case on how someone else has shared data that helps inform your particular industry partner and lower the concerns about my data being used in a way that I don't want. So make sure that you're looking at those terms in a reasonable manner, thinking about the other partner, and then making the comparables and learning about that. And then if you have not yet signed to an organization that is in this space between university and industry collaborations, I would definitely encourage you to do that. I am a member of the UIDP. ISU is a member of UIDP, so make sure that if your organization that you belong to is a member, you have access to all of these resources. They're coming up with a data sharing discussion coming up very soon. They're going to cover this topic, and they have all sorts of opportunities really to exchange. What are you doing? How am I doing it? What can we do differently? And there are leading organizations in animal and plant sciences that are involved in this as well, alongside with universities. So make sure that you take advantage of things like that. All right, I have said a lot. I just want to point out, I think public-private partnerships are critical in the commercialization of scientific breakthroughs. Are they difficult? Yes. We will learn as we go through them, making them starting off with simple transactional interactions and then creating them into long-term, objective-driven interactions that can help an entire region or an entire industry. I think that is how all of us satisfy our desire to contribute to societal impact. And I think the winners in this university industry partnership are those that keep an eye for what is the greater value that we can bring together that we couldn't do on our own? And so we win when the sum is greater than the total of the parts. When we have that, is that we're able to really get through and create societal impact.
Okay, thank you, Nadilia, for your insights, and I think others who can agree. The reason why we're very happy that people like Nadilia are here at Iowa State, but also appreciate that she's willing to share that with others, and that also holds for Addie. We're over time, but I think we'll take some time for questions if there are any. Maybe I'll start. So I was very surprised with the first to market poll, and that's actually something that Janet's bosses may say, well, yeah, you say it's important for us to be first, but there's no evidence that it benefits it. But I also wonder whether it's there's obviously a generalization, whether especially on the animal breeding side, our improvements are not so much a new product, but more improvements of the process of genetic evaluation, genetic improvement. So does it depend on what kind of product you're looking at? What the answer is to that question, or whether first to market is better?
I have not seen anything that breaks down specifically, this is what we see in plant breeding, this is what we see in animal breeding, this is what we see in proteomics, or specifically to that level. But I can tell you that this belief has been evaluated for decades, and there are so many other reasons why humans choose to go with one product versus another. There are cases where a phenomenal product goes out to the market and terrible weather conditions happen that year, and that's it. You lost the opportunity to show up the next year and sell that product to your customers. Weather, I mean, you can't even control that. So I would say that yes, it's important, but I love Janet's perspective on how to pitch this to the company. You can't guarantee that you are first to market and you're going to get a big piece of the pie. But you can be assured that if you put first your genetics and you're doing the testing and you're trying to develop good, solid products, you have a greater likelihood, maybe not just of that product, but your entire 15 years of breeding to create more products and be then the winner in the market. So I think that we have to demystify the idea that this is so top secret, nobody else is doing this in the world, and so I have to only keep it. What we've learned more and more is that if you've thought about it, somebody else somewhere else has already thought about it. And so I think that's a shift. That's a mentality shift. But we have to be open to a certain degree, and that's hard. That's very, very hard.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay, if there are none, if others come up, both Addie and Adelia are open to email them or contact them in other ways, and I'm sure they're happy to answer additional questions or have further discussion. So just to wrap this up, we won't have a field day in August, and future field days will be a little bit more irregular because we're kind of coming to the end of the AG2PI grant that we have that funds all of this. But we will have some additional field days, but they won't be as regular as they have been in the past. I think we've had a great series of field days, and today's was no exception. All 28 of them, they're on the AG2PI website, recorded. So share them with others who you think may be interested in learning about this. We had a small audience today, but I know that many people will look at the recordings. But yeah, feel free to pass this on to others who you think would benefit from this, including your bosses, Janet, and other industry people, because I think discussion also highlighted that this is just as useful for us in academics as it is for people in industry, and really need to make those connections. There will be another workshop, August 7, standardizing data management and terminology for increased adoption of virtual fence systems. And of course, that doesn't apply to plants, but applies to animals. Plants don't need a fence. But there might again be opportunities to learn also from the plant side on how to deal with some of these issues that may be relevant to your situation. So that promises to be a very useful workshop also. Register for it. Usually they fill up fairly quickly, so register for it. And with that, I'm going to thank also Nicole and Eddie for you need fences to keep animals out, but they don't have to be virtual. Well, they could be virtual, I suppose. Thanking Nicole and Eddie for their support through all these field days, and continue it on. And see you at a future event. Thank you all.